Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a very special presentation about our ongoing Elegant Trogon surveys. 10 years of data we now have, which is fantastic. And we're joined today by Jennie MacFarland, Tucson Audubon's bird conservation biologist and the organizer of all of these Trogon surveys. So Jennie's here today to tell us about what trends we've been seeing with this data. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jennie.
Thank you, Kirsten. Okay, so I do want to share my PowerPoint here because it's got a really nice visual that I'm about to refer to here. So let's see here, share screen, share sound, share. Okay. All right, well, welcome. Hello, my name is Jennie MacFarland. I'm the conservation biologist for Tucson Audubon Society. And I'm also one of the co-coordinators of the Arizona Important Bird Areas program. So this is a really interesting global scale bird conservation program that is sort of on a global scale headed up by BirdLife International out of the UK. And this is a really significant program that deals with locations that are vital habitat for native birds all over the world. And it's a very large program. It has over 180 countries that participate in the Important Bird Areas program. And BirdLife International then breaks it down from there and has to keep it all something viable that actually identifies correct habitats. They break it down by country, and they have a partner organization that runs the program for each nation. So within the United States, it is headed up by the National Audubon Society. And Audubon has divided up the IBA program into roughly statewide or certainly regional wide programs. So the Arizona program is part of this larger hierarchy of conservation programs that contribute to this global effort to identify and promote to the public, as well as to land managers and sometimes even lawmakers in other countries, the importance of these areas that are vital for bird conservation. So if you've ever helped with Arizona Important Bird Areas program surveys, or support Tucson Audubon, which is the co-coordinator for the program along with Audubon Southwest, you are supporting this larger effort to conserve birds around the world. So it's really a very cool program, and I'm really very happy to have it be part of my job of coordinating Arizona IBAs. And I focus, as you would imagine, I focus on the southern part of the state, southeast Arizona, as well as into the southwest Arizona. And Tice Sipley, my partner in the Arizona IBA program, who works for Audubon Southwest, she kind of tends to handle the northern part of the state, but together we manage the entire state. So the IBA program focuses on areas, as you might expect by the name, important bird areas, but it also has a huge focus on priority species. So in Arizona, some of our top priority species are birds like Mexican spotted owl, chestnut-collared longspur, which is one of the fastest declining birds in North America and has wintering habitat here in Southeast Arizona. Birds like Gila woodpeckers and Abert's towhees are priority birds because they're so range restricted to Arizona. And another top priority species we have is the elegant trogon. So we thought it would be an excellent bird to kick off a new series we're doing of IBA priority bird species, talking about some of these different birds, where they occur in Arizona, and some of our survey and conservation efforts around them. So elegant trogons are one of the most popular birds in Southeast Arizona, for sure. When you ask people who travel to Arizona what they came to see, you'll get a lot of answers, things like red-faced warbler, which are, these beautiful birds like painted redstart, are very popular. But the answer I hear almost always in the list that people say of birds they're here to see is elegant trogon, and for good reason. They're incredibly dynamic birds. They're so different looking from other species that we get in the United States, and they really are this family of the tropics. And we're very lucky in Southeast Arizona to be pretty much the only area in the United States that gets elegant trogons regularly. And as you'll see from our data as we move forward through the talk, we actually have a really pretty robust breeding population, and it's the only such breeding population in the United States. And that's a major reason that they're a priority bird for Arizona IBA, is they are just so restricted in the United States to this region. And before I move on from the next slide here, I do want to say that, so there's our logo of the important bird areas, the little swifts flying. But Arizona Game and Fish is a major sponsor of the Arizona Important Bird Areas program. They give us consistent and generous funding that has allowed this program to flourish and really made it possible for Tucson Audubon and Audubon Southwest to create one of the most robust, volunteer-oriented, bird survey and data-oriented IBA programs in the United States. So it's really a very good, very strong IBA program, and a lot of that is due to support from Arizona Game and Fish. Okay, so we have now done 10 years of elegant trogon surveys with Tucson Audubon and for the IBA program, and it is pretty interesting what we have found over those 10 years. All right, go to the next slide. There we go. So habitat is really important for all of these bird species, but it's very important for elegant trogons too. In Arizona, and we'll talk about this throughout their whole range, this can vary somewhat, but in Arizona, you're going to find elegant trogons in mountains, which are known as sky islands here in Southeast Arizona. So this habitat in Southeast Arizona is pretty special. And if you've ever visited or lived in Southeast Arizona and birded in some of these really famous locations like Madera Canyon or South Fork of Cave Creek in the Chiricahua Mountains, you were in a sky island. So these are really large mountain ranges that are these pockets of high elevation habitat that are surrounded, so it's metaphorical, the sky island idea, surrounded by a sea of grassland or desert. So this high elevation habitat and a sea of lowland habitat. And you get these really interesting plant communities that occur in sky islands. And a lot of it is sort of the chaparral and thorn scrub at the lower portion, like lower elevation portions of the sky islands, goes into oak woodland, and you have sort of to the tallest sky islands, you have all the way up to pine, and then alpine meadows at some of the taller mountain ranges at the top. And another really important feature of our sky islands is we have these really deep canyons. And this is going to be very relevant for elegant trogon habitat. They really are drawn to these canyons, and Madera Canyon is a good example. These are large canyons with drainages at the bottom that create a dynamic of habitat that is really important for a lot of species. So elegant trogons themselves have a really interesting range story. So, and this ties into a lot of our species in Southeast Arizona. So this map on the right is showing a static map of the range of elegant trogons. You can see they go all the way down into Central America, and there's several distinct subspecies of elegant trogon. But the one that we're used to seeing in Arizona is the coppery-tailed subspecies, and they are in Mexico, West Mexico especially. And this region here, where you see this red stripe coming up into this orange portion in Southeast Arizona, this is the range of the trogon, elegant trogon that we're used to seeing. And this region right here, which is shown on this more detailed topographical relief map, this is a interesting feature of West Mexico called the Sierra Madre Occidental. And this is a huge, very, very large chain of mountain ranges known as the Sierra Madre Occidental in West Mexico. And you can think of it on the same scale as like the Rockies. It's this huge collection of mountain ranges, very impressive feature of Mexico, geographic feature of Mexico. And it's mostly in Mexico. So the vast majority of the Sierra Madre chain of mountain ranges is in Mexico here, but it does extend into Southeast Arizona. And this is really important for understanding why we have elegant trogons in Arizona and so many other species as well. What we're about to describe affects a lot of the diversity of Southeast Arizona and why we have so many species you would think of as Mexican, primarily Mexico species occurring in Southeast Arizona. So the Sierra Madre mountain range is huge and in West Mexico, does extend into Southeast Arizona. And when you have species like elegant trogons that are spending most of their range, most of their population is in this West Mexico, Sierra Madre Occidental region, they can literally island hop north up into Southeast Arizona because those mountain ranges, the Sierra Madre ends, the most northern extent is in Southeast Arizona. So here's a close-up of that. So here's the US-Mexico border right here into New Mexico. And you have very large clusters of mountain ranges that are part of this larger Sierra Madre collection. And you have the most northern mountain ranges of this huge, huge chain of mountain ranges right here in Southeast Arizona. So here's the Chiricahuas right here, and the Huachucas, and the Santa Ritas, and the Patagonias, and over here the Atascosas right here, and the Catalinas, and you're starting to get into the furthest north mountain ranges of this collection. And the the Pinaleños is one of the furthest north, and kind of the Galleros and Santa Teresa Mountains are as far north as the Sierra Madre extends. And species like whiskered screech owl, which occur throughout that Mexican distribution of the Sierra Madre, have their furthest northern extension into places like the Santa Catalinas, and they just don't go any further north. So we're really lucky that we have this edge habitat of the Sierra Madre, and it works to pull a lot of these species north over the US-Mexico border. And they don't go much further. Southeast Arizona is pretty much as far north as a lot of these species go, including elegant trogons. And what this really has created is this bubble of Mexican associated habitat and species extending into the United States only in Southeast Arizona, and a tiny bit into Southwest New Mexico as well. But it's far more significant here in Southeast Arizona. So if you've ever seen one of my talks, you know I love these maps. So this is a animated eBird map. If you've want to look at these, they're really cool. If you go to ebird.org, they have, and you go to their science tab, they keep adding more and more species with these animated maps. So what we're looking at here is, this is a map of North America, Mexico and the United States, and some of Central America. And how this works is it's showing relative abundance. So as the color gets darker, gray means it's not reported. And as the color goes from yellow all the way to dark purple, that's an indication of abundance. And the map moves from January through December. So it's showing us relative abundance, how many are there, the density of how many are there reported, but also when they are reported, like when they're occurring. So let's watch this again. So you can see here, this ended in December. So in the winter, we have trogons all through West Mexico, a little bit into Eastern Mexico as well, different subspecies, but they're most dense here in this really nice part of the Sierra Madre and West Mexico. But let's watch what happens when the year starts over. So they kind of move around a bit, more in coastal, and then in the summer, May into June, there's more of them in Southeast Arizona. And this matches what we see during our surveys, where we have lots of elegant trogons occurring. So they're going to be here in Southeast Arizona. They're mostly here in late April through the monsoon, and then they tend to leave late August into September. Now that can vary year to year, as we're going to talk about, and you can see that in our data. But for the most part, the northern part of their range, they are migratory, which is what that previous map was showing, and we'll look at again. But they are migratory, and they're just talked about as being non-migratory or residential in most of their range. But as you can see from this map, they do move around within the range that they're in year round. They still do move around within it. Their abundance does move around, which is what you would expect. But so it's a bit more dynamic, and that's why I really like these maps. They give you more information than those static range maps, which are also very helpful, but these are really cool. So I encourage you to check these out on any species you're interested in on ebird.org. So trogons themselves as a genus are very interesting birds. So they are in their own order of birds, and they have a really interesting global distribution. So this is trogons in general, the order of trogons, so all of their relatives. So there's 37 species of trogons throughout the world, and they fall within 7 genera. So sort of 7 types of trogons, almost, is one way to think of it. And they have a really impressive worldwide range, and they tend to be kind of equatorial, as you might expect for a bird that you would think of as being very tropical. They tend to be in the tropics. But they have this really interesting range. So they're throughout South America, much of South America, and especially the lusher parts of South America. They're very intensely in Central America and Mexico, and barely come up into the United States, only in Southeast Arizona. And they're also abundant throughout the West Indies. Now, they're also in Central and Southern Africa. You have Trogons there as well. And then if you keep going east, they're in India, Southeast Asia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, which is really interesting. So they're more widespread than a US-based birder may assume. Because if it's so easy for us to, because of the way bird information is presented to American birders, we think about birds within the United States boundary. And Trogons, the only place you can get them in the United States is in Southeast Arizona. So it's so tempting, and I've done it myself. It's so tempting to think about Trogons in that context, which is a very important context, but they also have this worldwide context where they are actually relatively widespread throughout the world, which is really very cool. They have other cool things about them as a family. They are zygodactyl. Now that's a great Scrabble word and like bar trivia word. So what zygodactyl means for birds is it has to do with their foot arrangement. And it's one of those things that was used early on to try to figure out which birds were more related to others. So zygodactyl means they have 2 toes forward and 2 toes back. A classic bird that has this foot arrangement is greater roadrunner. So cuckoos have this as well, with 2 toes forward and 2 back, because most birds, of course, do 3 forward and 1 back. Think of like, pigeon tracks or something. They mostly have 3 forward, 1 back. Zygodactyl, 2 forward, 2 back is something you see in cuckoos, such as the greater roadrunner. You see that in parrots as well. Parrots have a zygodactyl foot arrangement, and so do trogons. So early on, it was thought, okay, maybe trogons are related to parrots, since they both have this foot arrangement. They're both very colorful. They both have strong, stout bills, and they tend to be in sort of this tropical, lush habitat. A closer look showed that it's actually, with trogons, it's the first and second toe that was turned back, which is different from parrots. Parrots have a different toe arrangement in terms of which ones point back. And then, of course, now genetics shows us that they're actually not that closely related to parrots or really any living group of birds. Trogons are kind of on their own in terms of birds that are still around. And because of that, they've been placed in their own order of birds, which is pretty cool. So trogons are a unique bird type and are really very interesting and dynamic. And this is, if anyone who's ever gone to see trogons in Southeast Arizona, you know how really interesting they can be. So of those 37 species of trogons in the world, 23 of them are in the Western Hemisphere. So they're very much a bird of the Americas and the West Indies. You do get them, of course, through Africa and Asia, but they're really at their most diverse and their most resplendent here in the Americas. Of course, the resplendent quetzal of Costa Rica is a trogon. It's in the order of trogons, and one of, easily one of the most magnificent birds in the world. So they're a really dynamic group. But the elegant trogon does stand out among other trogons as has the widest range of any of the trogons. And it ranges from, Costa Rica's rainforests all the way up to Southeast Arizona. And to do that, they have to be very adaptable, and they occur in a huge range of habitats, elevations and habitats. You can find elegant trogons in humid tropical forests all the way up to pine oak woodland of Southeast Arizona's Sky Islands. So amazingly adaptable bird, very successful in the sense that they have been able to successfully nest in just this huge geographic range, as well as just range of habitats. So they are migratory. How it's put in the literature is they're migratory only on the northern end of their range. But as we saw from that dynamic moving map, they do move within this purple portion, which is considered resident range. They do move around within that throughout the year as well. So I would think of them as sort of migratory throughout their whole range, but they move forward, they move up into Southeast Arizona in the breeding season. Although we do sometimes have a few that'll hang out throughout the winter. So that's kind of an interesting development that's happened over time. Elegant trogons do have a very distinctive voice, which we're going to listen to in a moment. They're incredibly distinctive plumage, but the voice is going to be the way that we see them that we find them most frequently in Southeast Arizona. They're such a brightly colored bird. They're surprisingly good at hiding. They do have a slow and heavy flight. If you've ever seen one fly, they have kind of surprisingly short wings for such a big bird and a huge long tail. And they do this kind of slow flapping flight that is also very quiet. That's been a thing with trogons too, that as we survey for them, their flight is surprised for a bird that big, is surprisingly quiet. They're hard to track as they move through the trees, but they also have amazing, when they need it, surprisingly maneuverable and very fast flight when they need it to avoid predators. One of their biggest problems is things like Hooper's hawks, and they're really good at avoiding that danger when they need to be moving around quickly. They really can. They do nest in woodpecker cavities or similar. They are cavity nesters, and they tend to have 3 to 4 white eggs. So I do want to put down my PowerPoint here for a minute, and let's look at some trogons moving, because photos of trogons you'll see a lot. Trogons get into our logo of our festival from previous years, which I have here as my background. And they are incredibly beautiful, but the way they move and the way they sound, I think, is one of the most dynamic ways to find them and get to know them. So let's listen to that. Breeding. So you guys can probably hear that ja 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 ja. It's really quiet call, and that's actually the call we hear a lot when we're doing surveys in May. We always do our elegant trogon surveys in May, and just so casually doing that little cha 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 call, and that can often be a bird that's relaxed, like this one's doing, where he's preening. But it's also a call that they'll do to each other. A male and a female will, especially the male to the female, will do that. But here's sort of the more common call that is a little louder and goes a little further. That's not the call one. Look at the beautiful patterns too. This is another thing with trogons. They have these beautiful fine detail pattern on their feathers. They're really, really very beautiful. And this one too, this shows also, I like this video because look what he's eating. This is going to be important in our talk too. They have this really huge dependence on large bodied insects. Very important to their habitat choices. Okay. They're very slow, deliberate movements. This is another thing with them. When they're hanging out in the canopy, they're very, or the midstory rather, where they tend to hang out most, very still when they need to be. When someone's looking for them, they can be remarkably still. And then when they fly, they do it very sort of quietly and deliberately, like you flew there. And it really can make them pretty hard to spot. So that they have that characteristic cha-cha-cha-cha-cha call that is pretty interesting sound and has been described as being like a frog. Okay. All right, so here we go. So, all right. So what's really interesting too to think about with trogons, especially as I think about the data of our surveys in the context of the last 10 years, is what's been going on with trogons throughout time. And when you do, I did a deep dive into history of elegant trogons in Southeast Arizona, and it's really very interesting because this seems to be a relatively new thing, at least in the context of what we know. And when Elliott Coos and Henshaw did a pretty detailed survey and search through Southeast Arizona, and especially in the Sky Islands in the 1860s into the 1870s, and did very careful documentation and reporting of everything they found in Southeast Arizona. They never detected an elegant trogon, which is really interesting because they were in the Sky Islands and they were here in the right time too. This was over several years, and they did spend time in the monsoon in Southeast Arizona, and they never detected an elegant trogon. And that is pretty convincing that they were at least very rare, if not absent. Now, the very first known record, sort of, this isn't accepted as an absolute record, but I think many people consider it as something that counts, is in September 20th of 1884. A person who was helping to construct one of the roads up Mount Lemmon, so north of Tucson, saw an interesting bird and went and reported this to a professor or like a bird expert in the Tucson area. And he was describing this bird as a bird of paradise, and he was giving physical descriptions. It had a white mark under its eye, etc. And this ornithological expert was convinced that what this worker had seen with his careful description of what he saw was a female elegant trogon. So that is often thought of as one of the first sort of documented sightings of a trogon in Arizona. And it was up on Mount Lemmon, interestingly, which you don't really get them that much up there now. But the first official record where there was a specimen collected is August 24th of 1885. And it was near Fort Huachuca by Lieutenant Benson. That name may sound familiar. And what he collected was an immature male. So an immature male, which implies that perhaps nesting, this bird had been perhaps born in Southeast Arizona, hatched in Southeast Arizona. So that's quite interesting. So 1885 is the first absolutely guaranteed record, but there very well may have been a report, accurate report the year before in 1884 in the Santa Catalina Mountains. Now, so that's the very first collection. And then by the 1930s, they were present in most south-facing canyons of the Huachuca Mountains. And then the very first record for the Santa Ritas was in 1918. So this is after, there's a lot of people around now. People are looking for these birds, collecting specimens. Egg collecting is a big thing now at this time. And this was 33 years after the first Huachuca bird. So that is interesting, where it seemingly took up to 33 years for them to at least be abundant enough in the Santa Ritas where someone noticed one. And then in the Atascosas, the first record, so Atascosas is that mountain range west of Nogales, like Parker Canyon Lake, or not Parker Canyon Lake, where Peña Blanca Lake is. The first report there was in 1972, which was 54 years later. And that's only a distance of 25 miles. So these birds seem to have this pattern of getting into a new mountain range and taking their time, really moving to a new mountain range. So it's really very interesting. And another really interesting sort of blip in the history of elegant trogons in Arizona is in the 1980s, someone did try a nest box study for trogons, where they built nest boxes that they thought were a good size for elegant trogons based on their natural nest cavities, and put them up in suitable habitat and trees around the Huachucas. And they did this for 4 years and monitored these boxes, and none of them were used by trogons, but most of them got used by something. So many of them had ringtails nesting in them, or sulfur-bellied flycatchers, or other species, especially mammals getting in these boxes, which I can't imagine checking a nest box and having a ringtail in there. It sounds pretty great. But so I thought that was kind of really interesting that someone did try that in the 80s, because we thought about it, and then we looked into it like, oh, someone already did this in the 80s. Now, in the mid 70s up until current, there has been another look at elegant trogons, because looking at past studies of who has been watching elegant trogons, it's been surprisingly undersurveyed bird for the United States. So Rick Taylor did, as a birding guide, owns Borderlands, formerly Borderlands Tours, and then wrote this book, Trogons of the Arizona Borderlands, as well as this pretty well-known little red book, Birds of Southeast Arizona. So Rick did do surveys of the mountain ranges of Southeast Arizona throughout the last decades. So in the 70s, he did some organized surveys and found interesting numbers. So in the Atascosas had a few in the late 70s into the early 80s. somewhere in the sort of looks like 7 to 12 range. And then in the Santa Ritas, this green line, the Santa Ritas had, 15 to 20 throughout, 77 to 83. And then the Huachucas, higher numbers, right? So up into the 30s. And then in the Chiricahuas, between 20 and 25. And then there was a break in survey, but then the Chiricahuas was the most consistently surveyed. And through the 80s and through the late 90s into 2000 were surveyed. And the Huachucas, the Chiricahuas, they were finding in the 15 to 20 range, which is, you'll see how that factors into our data as well, our more recent data. And then picked up again in the about 2008 into 2009. And then in 2013 is when Tucson Audubon got involved. But there's been some really interesting surveying that's happened before, like also during this time, because I really was trying to see, not only looking at the variability within our own data over time, but how it compares to surveys that were done in the past. And the best I could find was a researcher. I found a really good paper. And if you're into reading scientific papers, it's not very long, but it's really very good, done by Linnea Hall out of the University of Arizona. And she did 2 big studies. One was the breeding behavior of elegant trogons in Southeast Arizona, which is very good paper. And then multi-scaled habitat selection by elegant trogons in Southeast Arizona. And this one's very interesting. It's worth reading. It's fewer than 10 pages. It's very good. And what Linnea found was they did pretty extensive, I read their protocol, they did very extensive surveying throughout pretty much all the Sky Islands of Southeast Arizona, and had really interesting results. So they did this over 2 years. Well, actually 3 years. Well, the study talks about 2 years, but okay. They did multiple years of surveys. And in the Huachucas, it's this column that's really very interesting. Trogons counted. So they had 68 trogons, and this was in 1993 and 1994. They had 68 trogons found in the Huachucas, 23 in the Santa Ritas, 14 in the Chiricahuas. And I have to say, spoiler alert, this is very similar to what we have found in more recent years. But 6 in the Atascosas, and these ones especially are different. 6 in the Atascosas and 1 in the Patagonias. That really surprised me. 1 in the Patagonias. And you'll see when we talk about our data why I was so surprised to see that. And then 112 total for Arizona. So this is in the early 90s, what a very thorough study was finding in the Sky Islands of Southeast Arizona out of U of A. Now here's our data. And other than that U of A study and Rick's work, I couldn't find any other systematic bird surveys, like sort of, elegant trogon population surveys. So in 2013, Tucson Audubon, it was me with Tucson Audubon, decided to partner with Rick and expand the scope of the surveys that he had sort of pioneered in the Chiricahuas and the Huachucas especially. And we expanded the survey to include more mountain ranges and get more people involved. So 2013 was the first year that we did that, where I coordinated a larger effort than what Rick had been doing with Rick's help. And it took us a few years to sort of get our feet underneath us and figure out which canyons were the most important to prioritize in terms of surveying. So I tend to think of the first 2 to 3 years as almost like a practice surveys, to the extent where we were missing some of the more important ranges. We refined our knowledge base and protocols as we went on, but the results are still very interesting, and they're very consistent with what Rick and the U of A study had been finding. So now Atascosas were higher, 13 versus that just a few in the U of A study. Pull that chart up again over here. Yeah. So in the 93-94 study, in the Atascosas, they had found 6 total trogons. And even in that first year where we were still flailing a bit, just a little bit, we still had more, 13. And then in the Patagonias, where they only had 1, we were right off the bat at 15. And this is part of the reason that we decided to get involved in this, because the wisdom had been, because of things like this U of A study, that the Patagonians didn't really have a significant elegant trogon population. Now, I had seen trogons doing other Patagonia kind of all bird study, surveys in the Patagonians. I had seen trogons in there, so I knew they were in there. And this is really interesting to me too, because as we've done these surveys, people who live in the town of Patagonia have told me, who've lived there for many years, that they really believed that trogons had increased in the Patagonias, just due to their birding activity in that nearby mountain range over many years. it really seemed like there had been just a few in the past, and now there was this pretty robust breeding population. And I wasn't ever sure how to verify that until I found this U of A study. And so that really verifies what people have told me, this sort of, you know, people saying, it seems, because you hear that sort of thing a lot, right, in bird science, like, they're coming later or whatever, and you have to have data to verify that. And this U of A study does that. So in the early 90s, they're only finding 1 in the Patagonias. In our first year, we're finding 15. And then up into our height of 2018, we had 46 elegant trogons in the Patagonia Mountains. It's very, very interesting. It's a huge, huge increase that we can show with data. So this is a table of data, which is very exciting to bird biologists, but maybe less exciting to everyone else. So here's the data in a table, which is very interesting. And you'll note here, which we'll talk about in a moment, this high. So here's our total. So here's the survey years, each mountain range that we survey, the 5 mountain ranges we survey, and then our total for all of those mountain ranges. So it's gone steadily up from 2013 up to 2018, 2019, and then a high in 2020 of 2. We finally broke that 200 mark in 2020 of 201 trogons, and then this really interesting decrease in 2021, which was so interesting. And if you were around in Arizona and Southeast Arizona, especially from 2020 to 2021, you may have a sense of why this happened. And look at this drop. Chiricahuas went from 29 to 3. Huachucas went from 65 to 31. Patagonia's 26 to 7 between 2020 and 2021. Santa Rita's 56 to 20, and Atascosa's 25 to 6. Now, then the 2022, this year's data, 2022 data is very interesting also within this context. So tables are great, but it's even better to look at it in a graph. So the blue line here is showing the total. So this is between all the mountain ranges. And then the broken down colors here are showing it within each mountain range. But let's just look at the blue line for now, because my next graph is easier to see the different ranges. So for the total in Arizona, you can see it's just steadily increasing with a dip here in 2019, not a huge dip, but a little bit of a dip. And then a spike, our highest ever count in 2020, and then a plunge down into 2021. But then look at our 2022 data going up again. So that's why you want to keep collecting data, and why having 10 years plus of data is very important and significant. So here it is without that total, so it's easier to see the specific mountain ranges, but you can see the trends they track between the different mountain ranges. They all sort of increase. The Huachucas, which is this green line, had an interesting dip while others were increasing. Huachucas had an interesting dip in 2015, but then continued up on their trend. They all peaked in 2020, and then they all decreased for 2021. So what was going on? What was going on in those years? The monsoon is what was on the topic of discussion for 2020 into 2021. There were other really relevant, significant topics of discussion in 2020 into 2021 worldwide. But if you're in Southeast Arizona, the monsoon was another thing that really stood out besides all the other chaos happening in 2020. And it had a huge impact on what happened. So in 2020, we had a terrible monsoon in Southeast Arizona throughout the region. So what we're looking at here is a map from the University of Arizona. I will show you guys at the end of the talk a link of where I got these maps. They're very cool, and we'll send that link out to everybody, because if you want to look at it, it's a very interesting resource that U of A has put together. And what these are is they're maps, and they do one for every year. They're maps showing the monsoon rainfall as a comparison to the average monsoon rainfall. Okay, so what they're showing here is that if anywhere on the map that is white is indicating that it reached the average amount of rainfall. So if it's white, it means it's sort of right on par for average. When you start going into brown, and how dark the brown is indicating how much below average the rainfall was. And then as you start going up into greens and blues, which unfortunately this map isn't even showing any, but blues and greens are indicating how much above average rainfall is for the monsoon. So these are very interesting to look at, and they really can give a lot of context when you're looking at bird data. So here's 2020. Now, as you recall from our chart, 2020 was a peak. It was a huge boost in trogons. But 2020's monsoon was terrible. A lot of people were calling it the non-soon. So I have this statistic right here. It's 2020 was the driest year on record in Tucson, ever on record. Plus, August 22, 2020 was also Tucson's hottest month ever on record since, to start tracking it in 1895. So what was so interesting is that June of 2020 to June of 2021, so that 12-year span from June to June of 2020 to 2021 were the driest 12 months on record in southern Arizona. It was unbelievable. And if you were here, you know what I'm talking about. I mean, there was huge fires that happened. It was so dry. You go out into the Sky Islands and the trees were just brown and there was like hardly any grass. And this really affected a lot of birds. But the year before had been quite good. So the monsoon of 2019 was quite good. So when the birds arrived in May, because Trogons tend to show up late April into May. So when the Trogons arrived in 2020, it seemed like it was all right because the real serious drought didn't really start until sort of June of 2020. So this really impacted the results of 2021, if you see what I mean. And then of course, 2021 had a really good monsoon. We had, and that's what this map looks so different from 2020 to 2021. So a lot of it's white, which means it hit its average over, many decades, the average amount of monsoon rainfall, but also had areas of green and blue, which means 200 to 300% of our normal monsoon moisture. But this didn't start until July of 2021. So you had this huge dry spell, tremendous dry spell from, summer, from June to June of 2020 to 2021. So when the birds showed up in late April into May of 2021, it was so dry. It really was. It was so parched out here. And it was a tremendous, just awful looking drought conditions. Now that did break in the summer of 2021, but the birds arrive in April and May. And when they showed up, it looked awful when they started to arrive. And that really seems to be the key into why there was this huge plunge. Whereas I imagine, my theory is as elegant trogons were migrating north, they come north, they see how dry it is, and they just turn around and went back to Mexico. Like, we are not doing this type thing. This is not going to be a successful nesting season. Now, the monsoon did come through that year, but the conditions they encountered in the spring of 2021 were just dreadfully dry. And rainfall equals food. Elegant trogons are so focused on insect abundance, and they have to be, because the adults eat a lot of insects as well as fruit. Things like, hackberry berries, small fruits are very important to elegant trogons for the adult diet, but they eat a lot of insects themselves as adults, and they feed their young ones almost exclusively insects. So the nestling, so here's a female and a male with large bodied insect prey that they've captured. And then here's a lovely young one, a photo by Dan Weiss. What a great photo. With this young one just chowing down on this huge caterpillar. The ones in the nest are fed almost exclusively large insects. So they really need a lot of large insects. And you're not going to have that in Southeast Arizona without a good monsoon, and especially a good monsoon the year before, because that's going to really impact what's around that spring. And we had a crazy year in 2021. Not only did we have our lowest count, in more recent years, we also had trogons just turning up in the strangest places. So there's a record from 6 July of a trogon showing up in Sonoyta. This happened in sort of Sonoyta grasslands southeast of Tucson. Someone sent me a photo of a trogon in their yard in West Tucson, in the desert habitat. This bird is sitting in what looks like an ironwood in urban, kind of west suburban Tucson on June 7th. And then one of our most robust volunteers who helps us so much, Tim Hill-Jaris, got this trogon, looks like, it's a female trogon in Northwest Tucson as well. So also in sort of suburban Tucson on July 12th of 2021, and they got a photo and they e-birded it. And then trogons were turning up in Bisbee, which they had never been reported in before. So before the monsoon rain started, so they came kind of late. It was like mid to late July in 2021. So the driest part, where it was most desperately dry, would have been sort of June into early July of 2021. And these trogons were turning up in the oddest places. And this has to be related to the drought. I mean, it is. It must be related to the drought. So it was a really strange year for surveying, that's for sure. But I went back and looked at these survey work that had been done by U of A, by Linnea Hall. So this is the other paper, Breeding Behavior of Elegant Trogons in Southeast Arizona. And in their study, they found that nesting phenology was extremely variable, where 6 nests were started in May, and that's what we usually see is nests starting in May, and contained nestlings or had fledged by late June. 8 nests started in June, finished by late July. 6 nests started in July and had fledged young by late August. So their study found, over 2 years, found very variable nesting, which is not something we had seen that much in our surveying. We'd seen a little bit, but not that much. But 2021 was such an interesting year where the monsoon came kind of late. It was a huge monsoon, it was a very robust one. And it came after this year of awful drought. And people were seeing Trogon young quite late. So here's Louis Dombrowski, who, if you've ever been to the Patton Center, you may have met Louis. But Louis documented young with adult feeding young. So these are very young fledglings in Peña Canyon in the Atascosa in October. That is so late to what we usually see. And it matches, kind of tracks what the U of A study was finding was amazing variability in when the nesting could happen. And I went back and looked what was going on in the monsoon in 1993. And here it was quite low, quite a dry monsoon. So 1993 and 1994 both were pretty below average, aspiring to average amount of rainfall. You have some white on this map, but not very much in Southeast Arizona. And it was really not very much in 1993 either. So pretty low monsoon years in 93, 94. And they saw incredible variability in the nesting. And I think we saw something very similar in 2021, where the monsoon the year before had been very dry, and it really affected what we saw. So if you'd like to see some information about our survey, so the data I showed was very much a summary kind of overview. If you want to see really detailed information, you can do that. We make that available on our website. So if you go to the Arizona Important Bird Areas Program website, which is aziba.org, I have it here right at the top, aziba.org. If you go to that webpage and you go to our resources tab, you can scroll down. You can see also some of the other surveys we do. But if you go down, the Elegant Trogon surveys is one of our major things under resources there. And I have all this information about the surveys, what they are. I have a little video describing what to expect on an Elegant Trogon survey. And then I have these summaries of results. And you can go to those pages and see what happened year by year with the Trogon surveys. I have these interactive maps that we use with Google My Maps, and we put our physical data into these maps, which can be so interesting to look at the data in this way as it's mapped out. And you can go and you can zoom in and see, and you can click on each of those icons and see what the details were that the surveyor collected. And it's really very cool. And then I do these written out summaries too of all the different canyons we surveyed and what we found. So if you would like to go and look at this data, and we have it there for the last several years, and these really cool interactive maps, you can zoom in and see what exactly was happening in each canyon. And these X's indicate canyons that were searched but didn't find Trogons, which is very important to note where you are documenting zero. It's very important in a bird survey. So this is really very fun. And I put in some extra data too, especially in 2021, where the year was so nuts, where I put in like those sightings that happen outside of the surveys, things like those eBird reports from Bisbee are in the map as well, which gives really interesting context. Now, our participation and number of routes we've surveyed has been a very interesting thing to track as well, since that can affect your data. So we've had really relatively consistent participation. There was a dip in 2017, and there was a bit of a dip in the bird data too. It was it looked like a decrease in Trogons, which could be partly attributable to this slight decrease in participation. But the number of surveyors has been between 100 and 120, and did exceed 120 in 2022, but pretty consistent amount of people helping, and even more consistent number of routes surveyed. So if you're wondering about that, we do keep track of that as well, the effort. So we have averaged 106 participants over the last 10 years for every single Elegant Trogon survey. And if you have helped with an Elegant Trogon survey, thank you very much. It's a huge effort. We do 5 different mountain ranges over 5 different weekend days, and it is a huge amount of work. And many people do more than one survey. So 106 distinct people help with these surveys every year, approximately. So it's a huge effort, and thank you all so much. We have started doing these Google photo collections from the field of people taking photos while they're out there. And then we see such amazing sights. Of course, we see Trogons, but we also see all sorts of really cool birds and beautiful scenery and really interesting places. Like here's an interesting look at the border, sort of border wall area. And we do post these collections too. So if you go and look at the data on our website, we have links to these albums too of amazing sites that volunteers are out finding out there in the field. We were in the paper. So when was this? In 2021, we made the paper when we had that really low Trogon count. We were on the front page of the Arizona Daily Star. So I also have a link to a high quality PDF of that in the 2021 results page as well, if you want to read that article. And does anyone have any questions?
All right, thanks so much, Jennie. That was so interesting. If you haven't participated in an elegant Trogon survey and you happen to be in the Tucson area, I highly recommend it. It was a ton of fun. I got to see my first Trogons doing the survey. So, okay, so let's open it up to questions. So first, we had a couple questions come through the chat. Mac sent in a question. Where do the eBird data points come from and how specifically located can you see where individual data points are in the landscape?
It's a good question. So we get that eBird data by literally, sometimes people reach out to us and say, hey, I was in this canyon, I saw these Trogons. And then they'll send us an eBird checklist, but we just search as well, the public eBird interface. I actually have that up. Let me share my screen again. So I also wanted to share something else that I think will come up. Sorry, it's tabbed. The Zoom things block me seeing my tabs. Okay, so on eBird, you can go to these range maps for different species, and you can click in and see where they are. And so when you get even closer, you can see individual lists. Why is this still loaded? I had this up. So you can actually access, unless someone has specifically made an eBird list private, you can go in and access that data. And that is one of the ways we do it. I have a volunteer who helps me look for this data specifically, and then we go in and ones that seem relevant where they're close to our survey dates or significantly find data points that are outside of like a canyon where we didn't find very many or none, and then someone reports one a week later, that kind of thing. We do tend to include that in our maps as supplemental. It has a different icon and it's supplemental. So we don't ever include it in the official data, so that those tables and graphs, it wouldn't be included, but we do put it on the map for interesting context. So you can go down here and you can see individual lists and see the photos. And so this is where we're getting that information, is literally from a public interface. Now, another thing I did want to point out, because I think people may be wondering about it, is how can I help with the Elegant Trogon survey? And one thing you can do is, if you go to our website, if you go to the Tucson Audubon website, and if you go scroll down on any of these major pages, right here on the footer is this sign up for action alerts button. If you click that, it goes to this page where you can join our email list. And if you put in your information, you may have already done this for something like the weekly updates, but it's worth doing again if you're really interested in helping with this or other IBA surveys. If you put in your information and then click this IBA news option, you will get, when we send out our big sort of call for volunteers, and some of this stuff we tend to put in the regular emails too, those sort of general Tucson Audubon weekly updates, but our really specific IBA stuff comes to this list. And we're going to be doing a winter one, next week, right around Thanksgiving. So if you're interested in getting updates on the different bird surveys we do, as well as the sort of news updates about IBA, this is the best way to get that information, is to sign up for this IBA news link. Now, the Elegant Trogon surveys are always in May, and the weekends of May, pretty much. And we announced that to our general Tucson Audubon membership as well. But some of the more smaller scale surveys, like the grassland surveys, this is how you're going to hear about them, is to sign up for IBA news. Was there any other questions in the chat, Kirsten?
Yeah, there were. So Nancy had a question, which I think you addressed, but I'll put it out there anyway in case you wanted to add anything. Nancy asked, was there any indication that the number of Trogons reported was affected by the number of people who were or were not out observing them during COVID?
I think no, because Arizona was in this unique situation where not only were we able to survey successfully in 2020, even though it was May of 2020, after the state had its lockdown and many things decreased in 2020, many human activities. Arizona always had the stipulation in the lockdown that people were allowed to go outside for exercise, especially if you were in areas that were more remote. And our participation in 2020 was the highest we ever had for elegant trogons.
Wow.
People were desperate to get outside and delighted to be a part of a bird survey. And I think birders were birding a lot in 2020. If anything, I think there was more observers in 2020 than previous years. And I had never had more help from Trogon survey. And we also changed the way we did the survey, how we organized the survey, not the survey protocol itself, but how we coordinated people. We had to adapt for 2020 because before that, we always did sort of in-person meetings. We'd do sort of a workshop in person. We had a physical point where people returned their data. We couldn't do any of that in 2020. We had to adapt. So we did over Zoom like this, we did training orientations and sort of organizational meetings for the surveys online. We posted maps and data sheets online. And we also created an online data entry portal. So people, after they did their surveys, we organized it remotely like this. They went out on their own without meeting anyone else necessarily, or with someone, a partner, someone in their household, went out together, did the survey, came home and entered their data online. So we actually had incredible participation in 2020 moving forward, higher than ever. And a lot of that was just the way Arizona did its lockdown. And it's different from other states, but people were never restricted, pretty much never. And it's not in May, certainly restricted from exercising, going birding outside.
Awesome. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so moving right along, Mac sent in another question. Mac wrote, have you seen any records for the upper Santa Cruz River east of Nogales and west of the Patagonias from the border north to Keno Springs?
Trogons towards Keno Springs. We could check eBird. I have not personally noticed any records out there. Now, I wouldn't be surprised because that's relatively close to the Patagonias and they do wander a bit. And one area, let me share my screen and show this map now that it's working. So eBird is so interesting for questions like this. And if I wonder about things all the time, and then I just go to eBird and so much information is in here. It's really fascinating. So when you look at the Patagonias, they actually do spread out a bit. And going towards Keno Springs, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if people have seen them out there and maybe not put them on eBird or didn't report them. I have heard one of the really interesting things that happened was these trogons in the Canelo Hills. So the Canelo Hills is this foothills area, west of the Huachucas. And if you've ever been to Parker Canyon Lake, you've been in the Canelo Hills. It's a beautiful area. And no one really knew there was trogons in there until we were in there doing a different survey. So when we were doing our yellow-billed cuckoo surveys starting in the summer of 2015, out in one of our areas we surveyed was here, we were finding trogons throughout this area, but nobody really knew to look there. So now we've included it as part of our survey area. But so this is one we found in 2015. This was during a cuckoo survey in Corn Canyon. We had a trogon. So this is an area that people didn't really know they were out there. And then we found them. And now we do check it, and birders do check this area more regularly now. But yeah, so 2015. So a lot of these buttons are from us in 2015 when we were looking. But then 5 were found in 2020 by Collins Canyon. This was part of our bird survey, the 30th of May. This is one of our Trogon survey records that the volunteer put in. But so my point being, if there's an area that haven't been reported on eBird, I wouldn't be surprised if they could be there, and it's certainly worth checking. And if you do find them, make sure you put them on eBird, and certainly tell me if you find them in an area that's new.
It's so cool. It just shows the power of citizen or community science. I love that.
Ooh, here's a good question about quetzals.
Yeah, go ahead.
I know we're going a bit over, but if you guys bear with me here, this is a really good question. So eared quetzals is the other trogon that can turn up in Arizona. Now, elegant trogons are an established breeding population here in Southeast Arizona. They're here every year in significant numbers. Eared quetzals are far more sporadic. They were around, I know there was that nesting pair in the early 90s in Ramsey Canyon. but they've been sort of showing up very occasionally in Southeast Arizona, and they're by no means here every year. But there was that pair, I can't remember if it was 2020 or 2021, I think it was 2020, where they first showed up. And actually what's so interesting is they're not really abundant enough to track in a data sense like we do with the elegant trogons. But one insight that happened where that eared quetzal, that first report where it was found at Herb Martyr in 2020, that happened on the elegant trogon survey. So that was first found by surveyors, locals in the Chiricahuas, who were helping with the elegant trogon survey, and they first detected it, heard that squeak, squeak, which is such a distinctive sound, so different from elegant trogons, of the eared quetzal, and it was found on an elegant trogon survey. So we haven't found hardly. There's so few around, and there'll be long gaps of many years without any, and then a year or two with some around. At least a pair was around in 2020 into 2021, but then they didn't come back last year or this year. So that's been so interesting, and the fact it was found on the trogon survey was really fun for me.
Cool. Now I'm already looking at eBird to see how I can see one. Let's see. Just a couple more questions. So Laura asked, did the Bighorn fire have any impact on trogon numbers, or was it mostly the variable monsoons?
I think the Bighorn fire probably didn't affect trogons directly that much. There's hardly ever any reports from the Santa Catalinas. So the Catalina Mountains, just north of Tucson. It's not part of the survey, because for some reason you just don't get elegant trogons up there. You get the occasional report, especially when they're moving around towards the end of the season. So there is a small breeding population in the Galliero Mountains, north of the Catalinas. We don't go in there to survey because the access is so terrible. We did it one year and you literally have to backpack in to do it. So we have checked it. Birders occasionally report them there, but the population is so small, it's maybe one or two pairs, that we don't put it as part of our big official survey. But we have done it once, and so they are in there. So when people report them in the Catalinas, I suspect it's those birds moving north or south, passing through to go to the Gallieros. So that fire didn't impact them that much, since there's hardly any in the Catalinas. I think the region-wide drought and food availability is what really created that impact that we saw.
So another question about the low numbers. David asks, could low numbers in 2021 be due to unsuccessful fledging in 2020 and subsequently fewer young trogons to return as adults?
That's a really interesting thought. It could be, or adults who came up. I did think about that. Adults who came up, and either because there wasn't as many young born to return, could well be a contributing factor, as well as adults who just had a failed nest. Maybe like, let's not even go back next year. That was awful. It could be sort of that approach. I suspect most of it was as they were moving up and there just wasn't a lot of food resources to fuel them on their journey, they turned back. And I think another thing that happened too is trogons just arrived later. So if you go look at the 2021 interactive map, you'll see I had people go sort of supplementally off outside of our normal survey window, go and look in some of these ranges for trogons. And sometimes they found them where we didn't find them in May. They'd find them in like August or September. So I think some arrived late, kind of like what that U of A study had found, which then corresponded to people reporting young trogons much later than we normally see. So 2021 was an absolute oddball year, but looking at our May data, which is, we have to keep it consistent year to year, our May data showed a huge dip. And I think generally throughout the year, because people were finding some additional trogons after the monsoon started, but not a huge amount. So I think some arrived late, but it was still a pretty low year.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, was there any other last questions? I think that was everything in the chat, but if anyone wanted to unmute yourself to ask a question or put it in the chat, we could probably do one more. Okay.
No one has an additional question. I have one final thing to share, and that is and this is real quick, if you go to, we're going to send this link to everybody. This is the website that U of A has put together showing the monsoon maps, those monsoon maps every year. It's so cool to look at. And they started in 1981. But then as you go forward through all the years, you can really see how variable the monsoon has been in Southeast Arizona. And this has a huge impact on what happens, to us, to our yards and our gardens and our, the weeds in our yard and everything. But it has a huge impact on the birds too. And if you scroll through, you can see like here's 1999 had a really good monsoon. And then 2000 had a low monsoon, or, kind of average to low. And then some of these years are just incredibly high in New Mexico. And it's just so interesting to look at. So we'll send this link, and it's really very cool. And if you're ever wondering about something you're seeing in data, man, look at 2020. Look how brown that is, man. Even it stands out. Even as you look at it across the decades, it stands out as an incredibly dry year, followed by one of the wettest. So I'll leave it there. But the monsoon, it had such a huge impact on everything that happened.
It's such a cool resource. We'll definitely send that out along with the recording. So thank you so much, Jennie. That was a fabulous presentation. Thank you for sharing. And of course, thank you for all of your hard work in helping to count Trogons and therefore help to conserve them. We appreciate it from all of us so we can see them. Thank you all for spending the last hour with us. I hope you learned something and hope you come back for another virtual or in-person event soon. So have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.